Okay, it is a couple minutes after 1:30, so I think we will go ahead and get started. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for taking the time out of your day to join us this afternoon. My name is Lindsay House. I'm a licensing and recertification specialist with the Washington State Department of Agriculture, and today I'm joined by a couple other presenters as well. So also on the webinar is Tina Zimmerman. She's the program manager for the licensing and recertification program at WSDA. And we also have Henry Wetzel and Doan Joxon from Washington State University's Pesticide Resources and Education program. And our goal here today is to provide you with background and information on the federally required certification and training updates and our state's associated actions like rulemaking, as well as to let you know about updates to resources that will be made available. And before we get going, let's just go over some housekeeping items. This webinar is being recorded and we'll have that recording available on our website as soon as we can. We have turned off cameras and muted microphones of attendees to help things run smoothly. Questions and answers from today's session will also be made available online at a later time. And because we are recording this webinar, we're going to save questions until the end. To ask a question, you can either type your questions into the chat box at any time during the webinar, or you can raise your hand using the icon as shown on this slide. And if you did call in and you would like to ask a question, you can dial *5. That will show us that your hand is raised in the Teams platform, and then we will unmute you when we get to the Q&A portion of this webinar so that you can ask your question. And this is the general agenda for what we'll be covering this afternoon. We will take about 40 minutes to cover the material with an additional 10 minutes or so at the end for questions. So again, if you have questions, please just raise your hand or type them into the chat. And we'll start off with a quick background on the federal certification and training rule and what's been done so far. In 2015, the Environmental Protection Agency, EPA, proposed changes to the federal certification and training rules that states are required to follow. After EPA reviewed comments and they heard how their first draft would not work for states and applicators, EPA revised and they finalized their new certification training, or we call it the C&T rule, in 2017. And this was the first time that EPA updated that rule since 1974. So extensive changes were implemented affecting all pesticide applicators. Washington State Department of Agriculture submitted our updated plan to EPA Region 10 back in March 2020 to let them know how we were proposing to meet their new requirements, and EPA has accepted our proposal. They did that back in 2022. So let's take a closer look at our timeline. In anticipation of our plan approval, we moved forward with a legislative package in November of 2022 with Senate Bill 5330. This bill included statute changes for select certification and training updates, and those are actually now in effect. And we'll share more detail about what those updates were in a minute. We are also moving forward with the rule changes needed to implement our new certification and training plan later this month. That being said, we do want to give licensees and ourselves sufficient time to prepare to meet the new standards. So, given that our proposed rule updates pass, we have a tentative goal effective date of October 2025. And this is open to change, of course, based on how the rule changes go and how our efforts progress to update manuals and exams. So let's go over what's been done in our state so far to comply with the federal requirements. Senate Bill 5330 passed during the most recent session with a few changes to the Washington Pesticide Application Act, and that's RCW 1721. One of the changes was the increase to the minimum age for private applicators. Under the new federal rule, the minimum age for any certified pesticide applicator must be 18 years old. So to comply with this, Washington State had to update our statutes to match this minimum age requirement for private applicators. Some definitions were added and updated with SB 5330. The definition of direct supervision was modified slightly to clarify that the supervising private applicator must be immediately available to those being supervised. New definitions were also added for mishap, non-certified applicator, use, as in to use a pesticide, and use-specific instruction. None of these terms were defined in Washington state law or rule previously, and the definitions that were added are in line with the definitions established by EPA in their new certification and training rule. SB 5330 also established the authority to suspend or revoke a reciprocal pesticide license if the original license was terminated or revoked by the state that issued it. EPA did make it clear that states were required to establish this authority in our statute, so it was included in this last legislative action. SB 5330 also established authority for our state to adopt rules and standards on the direct supervision of non-certified applicators using restricted use pesticides. The rule change we are proposing later this month will include those rules and standards. And I'm going to pass it over to Tina Zimmerman to share more about that upcoming rule change.
Let's move forward in time to what rule changes we will be proposing for the general pesticide rules, Washington Administrative Code 16-228. One of the first sections in the general pesticide rules that will be updated is section 16-228-1300, which deals with dealer record keeping. Prior to the new C&T rule, there were no specific record-keeping requirements for dealers at the federal level. So when they imposed the new rule, Washington was already ahead of most states. There are a few changes, though, as the federal rule goes beyond what Washington state has in place now. So what are those requirements? The current requirements for dealer records include the name and address of the purchaser, name, brand, and EPA registration number of the pesticide product, quantity purchased, and the date of the sale. Additionally, for restricted use pesticides or RUPs, the records must also include the name, address, and license number of the licensed applicator purchasing the product, the name of the authorized agent picking up the product if it's different than the licensee, and the intended crop or site of application. With the new C&T rule, we will have to add a few requirements. So these include the expiration date of the licensee purchasing the product, any categories that the licensee has that are relevant to the pesticide being sold, and the site of application. Additionally, any emergency exemption or special local need registration numbers, if applicable, to the product and the intended site. The next area we'll cover is the changes to the license categories listed in 16-228-1545. Given this opportunity to update our rules, we tried to really think through how to set up our categories in a way that makes the most sense to applicators and the way their businesses are set up, while still meeting federal requirements. There's so much to go over with category changes, so let's just focus on the big picture. Here we have our big long list of categories or classifications, what that Washington currently offers, 31 categories in total. You'll notice that some of these are followed by LS, which signify limited specialty. Those are categories that are currently not defined specifically in our rule, as they are held by only a small number of licensees, which is about 250 licensees, maybe less. So after the proposed rules pass, we'll be left with 26 categories. This markup shows a broad overview of all the proposed changes. So as you can see, some categories are being eliminated due to being merged with others, or some are now being covered under another new category. Other categories are listed in red at the bottom. Those are the new ones that we'll be adding, and other categories will have a new name. You can see which categories are limited specialty that have changed, and you also might notice that aquatic antifouling and wood treatment are listed as limited use. So no real changes have been made to these categories. This is just a new way EPA wants us to classify certain categories that allow the use of restricted use pesticides, but they don't really fit under any of the other categories and the competency standards that EPA recognizes. This is probably a more friendly layout or a way to look at all the proposed changes for these categories. We plan to merge two groups of categories. We'd like to have one insect and disease control category that encompasses both agricultural and ornamental applications. We'd also like to have one weed category that covers agricultural, ornamental, and rights-of-way applications. So we plan for these categories not to get too specific into the pests or any of those details, but to really just focus on the core principles that a new applicator would need to know before getting out on the job. Because of the new way we would like to organize our categories, some will be eliminated. So stored grain, fumigant, and sulfur dioxide fumigation will be rendered redundant by the new space fumigation category, so they would have to be eliminated. Sprout inhibitor will now be covered by post-harvest fruit and vegetables, so will be eliminated as well. We will have to make a change to the limited specialty categories that we talked about earlier. Previously or currently, these categories are not specifically defined in rule, and we're just smaller categories that serve a smaller group of licensees. Now we can only have category or leave categories out of rule that just allow general use pesticide applications. So that will keep some specialized licensees who only apply general use pesticides from having to meet excessive competency standards required federally. There are some other miscellaneous changes to categories. We will be requiring either soil or the non-soil space fumigation category for all restricted use pesticide fumigations. Fumigations will no longer be covered by any specific endorsement. EPA is also requiring that the public health category is only valid for those working for government-sponsored programs. So other license types will need to make those applications under a broader category. And finally, we are creating the vertebrate pest control category to add ornamental sites. This will allow vertebrate pest control to expand to outdoor nuisance wildlife control in all locations. PCO General will still cover indoor pest animals like rodents, but again, neither will allow the use of fumigants. Let's not forget the addition of two new method-specific categories. Anyone making an application aerially needs to meet certain competency standards to be qualified to make that application. We are adding a new aerial category that will cover those competency standards rather than trying to integrate all those standards into the current category exams. So to make an aerial application, a licensee will need the aerial category to meet the new EPA competency standards for aerial applications, in addition to whatever relevant endorsement for that application. So let's go over an example. Spongy moth control. Currently, a public operator just needs an insect and disease control category to cover that use. However, with the rule change, the public operator would need both the insect and disease and aerial categories to legally make that application. EPA has also clarified that anyone who is involved in the application must be licensed with both the aerial and relevant endorsement categories. So this includes the pilot of the plane, the person operating the drone, and anyone else involved in the aerial application. The other new method-specific category we will be adding is space fumigation or non-soil fumigation. Space fumigants will include any true fumigants that are not used in soil. So this isn't tied to any specific license types. It will include all applicators. So private applicators will need to meet this new competency standard as well. Applicators using a space fumigant will need the space fumigation category to cover those competency standards, plus any relevant categories. So the setup is going to be very similar to aerial category. So let's go over an example. So say someone is fumigating a home with Vicane or sulfurofluoride to treat for termites. Currently, a commercial applicator can conduct this application with the PCO structural category alone. With the proposed rule change, the applicator will need the PCO structural category in addition to the space fumigation category. So next, we're going to hear from Lindsay on competency standards.
Thanks, Tina. So next we'll go over two proposed new subsections in the general pesticide rules that cover the competency standards for both private and non-private licensed applicators. The federal certification and training rule establishes the minimum competency standards that a pesticide applicator needs to meet to apply or supervise the application of restricted use pesticides. So these standards are meant to make sure that applicators have the knowledge necessary to use pesticides safely and with minimal risk to themselves and to the environment. Competency standards are not currently spelled out in Washington's general pesticide rules, WAC 16228. The EPA certification and training rule does require states to not only make sure that applicators meet these competencies, but also to include these specific standards in our rules. So adding competency standards to our rules will be part of the rulemaking effort this fall. Well, fortunately, Washington state already met most of the competency standards that the new federal rule requires. There are some missing pieces in, for example, private applicator, laws and safety, and soil fumigation manuals and exams. The new space fumigation and aerial categories that Tina just covered also have competency standards required by EPA's certification and training rule that will be new for Washington applicators to meet. And there's too much to cover in a short time, but I'll give you just a few examples of what those enhanced competency standards look like. So let's use laws and safety as our example, just to give you an idea of the additional topics needed. The laws and safety manual and exam will be updated to include the following: understanding the difference between mandatory and advisory label language, having knowledge of different types of equipment and the limitations of each type, understanding what the responsibilities are for supervisors of non-certified applicators, and I'll go over what those responsibilities are in a bit as well. Understanding what the requirements are for certified applicators directly supervising non-certified applicators using restricted use pesticides, understanding what the record-keeping requirements are for training records for non-certified applicators, and professionalism is the last competency standard that we're missing for laws and safety. And this includes things like maintaining chemical security for restricted use pesticides and how to communicate information about pesticide exposures and risks with customers and the public. So, what does this mean for Washington's licensees? Almost all current licensees will have to meet the new standards in some way. EPA has made it clear that they want to make sure that every applicator has shown competency in all of the topics that the federal rule lists. So this means that current applicators that studied manuals or took exams that didn't cover all these new topics will need to show that they have learned the missing topics in order to keep a valid license. EPA will not allow grandfathering in of existing licensees that weren't initially trained in those topics. And because we understand the burden this could pose for everyone, we tried to develop a straightforward way for licensees to meet these new standards while still meeting the requirements EPA is imposing on states. So in our state plan that EPA has already accepted, we proposed three ways in which licensees could meet the new standards. The first option is taking a short quiz that only covers the missing standards from the original exam that a licensee took. The second option is for licensees to take a recertification course that just covers the standards needed. This recertification course would still count towards a licensee's existing required credit hours while also meeting the new federal standards. And then the third option is retesting. So when the new rules are passed and in effect, licensees will have the remainder of the recertification cycle they are in at that time to meet the new standards. And we know that that does mean that some people will have a shorter time to meet these new standards than others, dependent on where they're at in their recertification cycle at the time the new rules are implemented. But we still think that the time to meet standards will be sufficient for all licensees going forward, given all the options available. EPA's certification and training rule update also articulates the requirements for the direct supervision of non-certified applicators and mandates that states must maintain these requirements in our statutes or rules. Our proposed rules will add a third new subsection to cover these requirements. EPA established a minimum age of 18 for non-certified applicators applying restricted use pesticides under the direct supervision of a certified applicator. And we will add this to our state rules with our next rule change. There is an exception to this minimum age requirement, and that is the non-certified applicator applying a restricted use pesticide under the direct supervision of a certified applicator can be 16 if they are applying under the supervision of a private applicator who is an immediate family member. And this exception does not apply if the RUP being applied is a fumigant or if it's being applied aerially. The requirements for the direct supervision of non-certified applicators outline the responsibilities of the certified applicator who's supervising those non-certified applicators and the training requirements for those non-certified applicators. The responsibilities of the supervising certified applicator include explaining any applicable state, federal, or tribal pesticide laws and rules. The supervising certified applicator must also provide use-specific instructions to each non-certified applicator before they use a restricted use pesticide. This would include directions for use, precaution and first aid, and requirements specific to the site of the application, things like groundwater or endangered species considerations. The supervising certified applicator must make sure that the non-certified applicator has access to the full pesticide label. They must also provide access to clean and functioning personal protective equipment, or PPE, and assure the non-certified applicators are actually wearing that PPE properly during any activity defined as use, and also when required by the label. They must also provide access to the proper equipment that needs to be used for mixing, loading, transporting, or applying pesticides, and they must provide instruction on how to use that equipment before the initial use of an RUP and every 12 months after that. The supervising certified applicator must also have a means to immediately communicate with the non-certified applicators, and that's defined by each license type under Washington law. And finally, they must also verify that the non-certified applicator meets the minimum age requirement that we talked about in the last slide. The new certification and training rule also imposes training requirements for the non-certified applicator with regard to the use of restricted use pesticides. Originally, the federal rule only required the non-certified applicator to be competent, but it did not provide guidelines, policies, or metrics to help states articulate what that really means. So the new rule establishes specific training requirements which can be met in a few different ways. If the non-certified applicator completed handler training or a train the trainer program, they would be considered adequately trained. If the non-certified applicator actually holds a license, but just not in the category required for that application, they would be considered an adequately trained non-certified applicator. And the last option is through a customized training program that meets all the requirements outlined in 40 CFR Part 171.201. The supervising certified applicator must verify these training records and keep those records for at least 2 years. So that wraps up the requirements for non-certified applicators and the supervising certified applicators. So next up, we have WSU to provide an update on study manual resources as we prepare for these changing requirements. So
Hello?
Doan, yep, can you take control or do you need me to move your slides for you?
Sorry, I was trying to find my mic. Okay, I think I've got it under control. Hello. My name is Doan Oxen, and we'll be talking about the WSU updates for the pre-license training and recertification. So Henry and I are new, and I just wanted to take a second to introduce ourselves. My name is Doan Oxen, and I am going to be the pre-licensed pesticide safety educator. And Henry, who will talk about the recertification um, slides, he's the new recertification pesticide safety educator. And so for the pre-license training, our updates include we are going statewide, especially after COVID. We are kind of ramping up our in-person training. So we're hoping to have a lot more West Side trainings and than Eastern Side trainings. We are also restructuring our curriculum to create more hands-on activities to help people understand the concepts better. But it will remain it will cover loss and safety, insects and disease, and weeds. And then we're also going to be incorporating the additional competency standards that WSDA just mentioned. And then our future plans for pre-license training is to create a PCO training and also to remake our internet courses with our new learning management system. And then for the study manuals, we are kind of overhauling a lot of our study manuals to create learning objectives for clearer ideas and to create more guidance for people studying, to make them more digestible using more diagrams, less walls of text, and more succinct info. And we are working with our Spanish program team to translate a lot of our manuals and other materials into Spanish. And of course, we are going to add the new competency standards that will be required for you to know for the exams, as well as well, we're going to see if we're going to be able to make an aerial and soil fumigation manual specific to Washington. And so our timeline, we're looking into updating and revising the manuals for loss and safety, insects and disease, general weeds, and private applicator this year. And then we're going to try and move into our PCO and SBI, aerial, and soil fumigation. And then the next our last kind of like our last group would be the smaller groups of categories. And then I will have Henry talk about the recertification.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yep.
Great. My name is Henry Wetzel. I'm with WSU Pesticide Program. Just a very brief update for recertification for 23-24. We'll have 5 Eastern in-person events and 4 Western in-person events. We have a webinar series, which will be December and January. And then, of course, we have the internet courses that are on demand, 35 English courses and 6 courses in Spanish. Next slide. Thank you. I plan to collaborate with the WSDA staff to assist in disseminating the C&T changes to the licensed applicators. Hopefully between both organizations, we can determine the best way for applicators to be trained to learn the new competency, and then hopefully we can offer some sort of a training or testing as well for applicators. Thank you.
Oh, thanks so much, Henry and Doan. Really appreciate the update. As you just saw, a lot of things are changing and we're working together to effectively and efficiently carry out these changes as best we can. So what's next? Let's take a look at our implementation timeframe again. Here we are, October 2023, and we'll be initiating the rule change process for everything we presented to you earlier, just a bit ago. Again, there will be no grandfathering in of licensees, and all licensees must show competency in the new standards. Once the rule passes and becomes effective, licensees will have the remainder of their recertification cycle at that time to meet those new standards. So let's look at an example. If the rule change goes as planned, all manuals and exams are updated and available for use with an effective date of October 2025. This licensee will have until December 31st, 2027 to meet all the new standards they need to continue their work. So for example, all the missing standards in laws and safety, and dealer manager, because this person has a dealer manager license. Space fumigation to replace this fumigant license here, or endorsement. And insect and disease, they will need to meet new standards. They currently only have the ag insect and disease, so they would need to do a little bit more just to cover the ornamental and the rights of way insect and disease. I'm sorry, I'm thinking of the weed control, the ornamental insect and disease category. As we mentioned earlier, if it's not a brand new category, there will be 3 options. A short quiz that only covers the standards missing, a recertification course that covers those missing standards, and of course, there's always retesting. We wanted to also share with you a resource you can rely on to understand all those changes that are coming. So you may have already seen this, but just in case you haven't, we publish webinar recordings covering all the C&T requirements and changes. From our main licensing page, you can get to the C&T rule webinar recordings. The proposed updates page looks like this. We decided to separate each topic into individual short videos and create playlists applicable to different user groups. We really didn't want to have one long webinar you have to sit through just to get to the information that you're looking for. So if you click on one of the playlist links, so let's say we click on private applicator, you'll get to a YouTube playlist like this, and everything applicable to that user group. You can skip around to the videos that you want to watch or watch all of them in just one after the other, because some of these may not be applicable to your situation. You want to be able to skip around. So for those of you who haven't seen this before, to get to our C&T webinar site, you can just go to WSDA's website at agr.wa.gov and click this Let's Find It button. In the search box that appears, type certification and training, then click Find It for me. The C&T webinar page will be that first option that pops up for you. We know that was a really quick overview of the certification and training updates and the rule changes moving forward. We would like to open up the webinar for questions at this time. So if you do have a question and haven't already raised your hand or typed a question in the chat, please do that now. And if you've called in, you can dial *5 to raise your hand. So I see one question for the statewide category. So that category will no longer be in effect. So any category that you need to continue your work, you would need to meet those new standards. Let's see. Can you show the timeline again? Sure. Let's go back to that slide. So here is the proposed implementation timeframe. So we're here at October 2023, where we would like to begin the rule change process. This is a guess, summer 2024 anticipated completion of the rule change process. That is if everything goes as planned with public hearings and every other part of the process. Within that rule, we'd like to establish a later effective date. And just working with WSU, we need time to kind of really understand when that's going to be. October 2025 is the earliest we want to have that happen to be effective for licensees, because we do know this is a really big lift for everyone, licensees, WSU, and WSDA. How will this affect reciprocal licensees from Oregon? So can you clarify that? Do you mean that you are recertifying via reciprocal as well? If you are, Oregon is working towards updating their standards to meet the federal requirements as well. So we are actually currently reevaluating all of our reciprocal agreements with other states. So that is ongoing at this time. I don't have a clarifying answer for you. Lindsay, do you have more detail on that? I don't. We're still kind of looking at things from my perspective.
Yeah, and it looks like they gave a thumbs up, so I think that that was kind of the angle that they were coming at it from. They already have a
Hmm.
license reciprocated from Oregon, and I would say that it will probably function kind of similarly to how things have
Hmm.
gone now, where you can either get your credits in Washington or get your credits in Oregon. Oregon applicators are going to need to meet the new standards as well, so I think that you could probably choose which state that you want to kind of use their method to meet new standards. And go from there. But we can have more conversations on exactly what that looks like for your specific situation too.
Hmm. Yeah. So will there be a supplement for the Laws and Safety Study Book update? We just purchased several. That is something we're going to be talking about with WSU actually, and how to address that, this in between kind of phase that we need. Um, that is one suggestion that came up in the past, is to provide like something that we could distribute or just have available, but that is not set in stone quite yet. Um, since we just had our plan approved last December, we're moving forward with our kind of collaborative discussions with WSU at this time. But that is on the table. Yeah. Okay. Were there any other questions? Is anyone else trying to raise their hand and hasn't been able to? Let's see. Oh, Dylan.
Um, just so that maybe to make it more clear or like to clarify, or guess get clarification from you, Tina and Lindsay, what it the enforcement of the new CNT requirements in October 2025, is that when you're changing the exams to reflect those new competency standards? Because then, like that would be the timeline to either send out those supplement or like
Mm-hmm.
new laws and safety. So like for now, the current laws and safety book should be good for your
Yeah.
exams, correct?
Yes. Correct. Yeah. That is good right now. Absolutely. So let's just, you can stick with what you have now to cover any laws and safety exam you will be taking in the near future. So the enforcement of the new CNT requirements won't be for another 2 years, at the earliest, that you would need to know and study for those new competencies. So at that time, or after that time, is when we would need to have those new resources available for you. Will a delay in the WCC for the new standard delay the overall? It will have to. Yeah, I'm sorry. I should read the question for anyone who has called in. Will a delay in the WSU study manuals for the new standards delay the overall implementation of the new CNT plan? Yes, any resources needed to meet the new standards will impact full implementation, because we can't impose those new requirements if resources aren't available for licensees, new or existing, to meet those new standards. That would be an unfair imposition of regulations.
We will try our best not to delay.
Yeah. So so that's why in that rule language, when we have the effective date, we really want to chat with WSU and maybe have a very collaborative approach to that, to make sure that we are all realistic about those expectations. Were there any other questions?
Tina,
No?
if you could go back to the
Um,
contacts slide just to
sure. Go.
show that one more time in case, after thinking about this more, if anyone has questions, that top email address, the pest license updates, is a great place to send questions about upcoming changes. Um, and if no other questions, which I see none, Looks like that's it. So I think this will go ahead and conclude today's webinar. We have a repeat of this exact same information on Thursday, October 12th, also at 1:30 p.m. And the link to that webinar is available on our website also. So please keep an eye out for future updates and more detailed information on the certification and training changes. And thank you all and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.